Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit more and do a bit of a deeper dive into the PvE preview, which was posted by Riot Scruffy over on Twitter, talking about the things that Riot are planning on changing in the upcoming patch. A couple of these changes have already gone on to the PvE, but there will be the rest deployed tomorrow, so I felt like it would be fun to kind of talk a little bit about why the changes that are being made, and to kind of speculate at the other changes that we may see tomorrow. So let me know what you guys think. This is a bit more of an experimental video, so if you guys like this, I can do more of this in the future, or if you decide, hey, that wasn't really that great, let me know that as well, and I can maybe try to find something else to do. Either way, I'm going to be going ahead and talking about the biggest changes. There are a lot of changes on this PvE cycle, a ton of champion nerfs and a ton of champion buffs, which is always exciting, as well as a couple of systemic changes. So definitely going to be just covering the most important ones here and kind of talking through why the changes are being made, as I already said. Now, the current changes that are on PvE are to Turbo Chemtank and Trinity Force. Chemtank is being roughly nerfed here, and Trinity Force is being generally buffed. Now, Trinity Force is the most exciting of these two, so I am going to start there, in that Trinity Force, for the longest time, ever since the rework, was a bit of an unusable item, given that it was so very attack speed focused. It gave 35% attack speed, and the Mythic passive gave additional legendary items an additional 10% attack speed. What this meant is that Trinity Force, though it was billed as a fighter item, was essentially giving too much attack speed for any fighter to actually ever consider buying it, outside of a couple of small examples like Aurelia, who can use that attack speed quite efficiently in fights, and who still wants the Sheen passive. However, a lot of other champions that have previously or historically built Trinity Force, champions like Garen or Darius, really just didn't need the amount of attack speed that this item was giving them, and they're already bound to things like Stridebreaker nowadays, but they just don't care about the attack speed, and even champions that do care about the attack speed to a certain extent were hard-pressed to justify just how much it was giving. Like, we're talking about like 80 carry levels of just straight attack speed on this item. So the changes here are essentially designed to make it more palatable to a lot more of the top lane pool and a lot more of the fighter pool, by making it less oriented around that attack speed pump. Accordingly, the attack damage of the item has been adjusted upwards, the attack speed has been lowered, and the Mythic passive has been changed from granting attack speed to 3 attack damage, 3 ability haste, and 3 movement speed per legendary item. Now, obviously, this is already a bit of a flavorful thing by saying, you know, we're going to do everything in multiples of 3 for Trinity Force, which I do quite like, but it also means that now that this item is giving sort of a general hodgepodge of stats that does include attack speed, it means that former champions that like Trinity Force but just couldn't justify all the attack speed it was giving can now start building it again. So even champions like Garen, Xin Zhao, and Shyvana can kind of look at this item and say, yeah, okay, I can maybe justify building this, and it really doesn't nerf it in a meaningful way for the champions that were building it for the straight up attack speed it was granting. Like, they're still totally building this and are totally happy with it because they still enjoy all of the stats. They get a little bit more value out of the attack speed that this item's giving, but generally speaking, they're a lot happier with the way this item is now. Chemtank is also receiving some changes on this patch that are intended to be roughly power neutral. I do still think it's a bit of a nerf, which is kind of sad, but it's not that big of a deal. The supercharge active movement speed has been lowered to 60% from 75%, and the slow has been increased from 40 to 50%. Now, this is generally speaking, I would say, a slight nerf. The reason you bought Chemtank in the first place is because you wanted the bonus movement speed to close the gap with these sort of frontliners and tanks that have generally and historically had problems with actually closing the gap on enemy champions. Right, like, the reason you bought it on champions like Udyr isn't because it has an AoE slow, you bought it because it lets you run real fast at the enemy. So, generally speaking, it is still a net nerf. However, it does mean that when you're able to get in, you are still going to get that nice 50% slow to stick to the target slightly longer. So especially if you're a champion like Skarner who does go phase rush, you may be able to consider not necessarily going phase rush because of how nice that sort of lets you stick to targets. Again, it's a very small buff, so it doesn't fully compensate for the 15% movement speed drop of the item active, but it's still generally worth talking about in my opinion. I do think it's a reasonable place to take this item, given that the champions that have been building it have been top of the heap for quite some time now, I would say. Finally, talking about the plan changes, which this will be a lot more speculative. Obviously, we don't know what these changes are quite yet, but be able to talk a little bit about what I think the direction Riot might take for these, starting, of course, with these systemic changes here, especially the item changes. Essence Reaver is planned on taking a nerf on this patch, which makes sense. It's really good now thanks to the Sheen passive champions are able to build that early for the easy Sheen poke, and it does a lot to curtail certain champions' mana needs in lane without going through the power trough of Tear of the Goddess that Riot kind of anticipated champions would be sitting through. You just kind of rush Essence Reaver. You don't really miss out on your mythic item passive yet because that's your first item. It gives you sustain, it gives you additional Tear of the Goddess, or it gives you additional Sheen poke. Like, it's really, really good overall. I would expect to see this item drop in the power of its offensive stats in order to make it more about the mana sustain and that sort of a thing, rather than the just raw value it's providing with things like the Sheen Poke and the additional AD. I'd expect to see the attack damage on this item probably drop down, but we'll see what Riot have planned for it. Everfrost is also receiving a nerf on this patch. Riot deliberately overbuffed it in order to help players sort of buy it and understand why it's worth buying. Technically, that item was in a fine state a little while ago, and Riot basically buffed it to the stratosphere to try and say, hey guys, this is a good item. You don't have to build Liandry's Anguish or Luden's Tempest in every single game. Now that players have started buying it and are realizing just how good it is and just where it can be used, now they're going to be nerfing it back down to a sustainable place in a similar fashion as they've done some of the other items where they do this sort of overbuff and then nerf it later once players actually realize it is an option. So don't consider, I wouldn't consider the nerfs to be that significant on this item. Whatever it is they decide to change, it will still be in a good spot afterwards. Finally, interesting change here for Cyrilda's Grudge, which I'm not quite sure what Riot plan on doing this. I feel like it's an item in general that is a bit niche, and a lot of, especially fighters who I feel like really want the ability to stick to targets, it's a little tough for them to justify exactly what Cyrilda's is doing for them and to fit it into a place in their build. A lot of other items feel like you absolutely have to be taking it, as opposed to Cyrilda's, which is sort of like, yeah, okay, it's nice, but I don't necessarily have to build this item. So I would expect Riot to buff up the slow on it in order to help indicate exactly why it's worth buying, in a similar situation as Everfrost, as I mentioned earlier, where Riot sort of buff it up in order to say, hey, here's why you want to buy this item, and then nerf it back down once players realize how good it is, because I think it is a good item. The question is just, generally speaking, is it always worth building, and in what sort of context? So I could see maybe a change aimed at adjusting what stat line Cyrilda's Grudge gives in order to make it a little bit more enticing as a sort of third or fourth purchase, potentially. Finally, moving on to the champion changes. There are a bunch of nerfs I do want to talk about here, as I think that those are sort of easier to discuss. First and foremost is Udyr, which this might be a little too early given that Turbo Chemtank is getting a love tap on this patch as well, and that's sort of the reason Udyr is super good. But he also really had a ton of buffs directed at Phoenix Stance recently, and it's really doing a lot of work for him, especially in terms of his upfront burst damage. So I would expect to see the nerfs directed at Phoenix Stance, given that I feel like it's been overbuffed. I could see Riot reduce the overall early pressure that Udyr has in terms of his ability to clear the jungle, potentially an attack speed nerf, or generally speaking, a nerf to what his early stats are giving him, in order to sort of remove his ability to clear super quickly and oppress a lot of the other champions in the game that do similar things. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, but generally I'm hoping it is a Phoenix Stance nerf at the end of the day. Hecarim is also getting nerfed on this patch. Riot didn't hit him nearly hard enough on the previous one. I guess that they would continue to tap down his durability to entice him into riskier damage-oriented build, so probably they'll nerf his base stats in order to make him squishier and more reliant on buying stats, rather than just kind of standing around and getting by with his base stats and getting some value from there. Alternatively, I could see some nerfs to his W, as that does do a lot to increase his durability in fights, potentially either a cooldown change on that or something like a reduction on the amount of healing he gets, just in general to make it a little bit harder for him to sort of go full tank and still be able to do what he does. Rell is also ideally receiving nerfs on this patch. Turns out her 18 different ways of engaging on enemy champions is quite strong for that champion, so I'd hope that Riot would either nerf down her damage or her crowd control in some way in order to preserve her niche as a tank. But given that their track record is nerfing something silly like the champion's durability, even though they're supposed to be durable, I'm not that I wouldn't be surprised if they did decide to do something silly like nerfing down her W shield or her E resist, even though she is supposed to be a tank and that's what she's supposed to be good at. So we'll see, but I do feel like at the end of the day it is going to be more along the lines of Riot nerfing down her durability as opposed to anything else that's making her strong. Tristana is also receiving nerfs on this patch, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody. If an AD carry that's traditionally been a bot laner is starting to see solo lane play, it's a problem. I'd love to see Tristana take some early game nerfs to her E or W damage, or to her base attack speed in order to reduce her early game strength especially. For how well Tristana scales, I feel like she should not have an early game that allows her to not only compete with solo lane champions, but bully them in some situations. I do feel like that's a little bit out of line for a champion like Tristana, so I would expect Riot to try and nerf down those stats in particular in order to reduce her sort of individual strength and return her to a dual lane where she has a support to help take up the slack from the missing damage that she's getting from potential E nerfs or potential W damage nerfs, as that does do a reasonable amount of damage, especially at level 2, so would not be surprised at all to see if that would be the case. Finally, moving on to talk about a couple of champion buffs here. Yasuo is being buffed on this patch, which is super interesting to me. I haven't felt like he's been in a terrible spot, and it's especially interesting to see that he's being changed without Yone receiving changes. Those two have seemed glued to the hip recently, but Riot are looking to buff up Yasuo. I don't feel like it's going to be anything that revolves around his itemization. I think that especially after the most recent round of changes, that Yasuo and Yone both have felt pretty good about the itemization changes. Rather, Riot will likely tweak his base stats in order to make him a little bit more survivable in lane and a little bit less bullyable. And finally, the last thought I wanted to have here is the Varus buffs. I'm really hoping that Riot do continue to buff up AD Varus. It's felt very in the lurch following the Mythic Item System update, as obviously an on-hit Varus just goes Kraken Slayer into the on-hit build that we all sort of know and love, whereas AD Varus doesn't really have a good Mythic item for him to build, so it's sort of in the case where I feel like he does need the base stats to compensate in order to sort of fill in the slack for the fact that he doesn't have a good mythic item to build on him at all. Like, Eclipse is okay, Prowler's Claw is okay, but there's no item that just screams, build me AD Varus, so would expect to see more buffs aimed in his general direction, especially for that build. And that's going to be it for me today, guys. Again, let me know what you thought of any of this down in the comment section below, or what you think the potential changes might be to any of the champions on the list. Obviously, I will have that tweet linked down in the description so you guys can check it out and take a look. And hey, if you have a thought for how Riot might be changing your favorite champion, let me know that down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.